It's an interesting, I think, and lovely parallel given in the gospel, and often when forgiveness of sins is like compared to forgiveness of a debt. And we can all understand what it feels like to be in debt, or certainly to know people who've been in debt as well, and how damaging, anxious causing, and also destructive that can be. I think one of the things, though, in that gospel that is quite striking is how punishing it is for people, because if they're in debt, sometimes it's not just that person, but their whole family that can be imprisoned in order to recover what is owed. We might think, oh, things aren't quite so bad now, but we know ourselves that with debt collectors and so on, it can be a punishing experience. A few months ago, I was supporting a young man who'd been homeless and helping him get into a rented accommodation. So that was done anyway, but unfortunately, after a few months, he stopped paying his rent, and so they wanted to recover their money. And they came to me, in fact, because they thought I was his guarantor. So firstly, I got a bill for £700, then a bill for £1,700, and then the bills were going up because they're employing a bailiff, they're employing solicitors. And we hear, don't we, how a relatively small amount that is owed can accumulate, and people's lives can be ruined. They can be made homeless and suffer terrible anxiety as a result. So our own world is far from forgiving. And that sense of the destructiveness of financial debt is like an example of also the destructiveness that can be caused by a failure to receive forgiveness or to forgive as well. There was a cardinal in America called Francis George, and the phrase he coined, which I think is an interesting phrase, he says, "We live in a world where everything is permitted and nothing is forgiven." I think that's true. In spite of the fact that we live in a permissive society, there is often very little forgiveness. Media takes great pleasure in finding the faults in various people, maybe especially famous people. And as permissive as we are, they're never forgiven. And the church is almost the opposite of that, where not everything is permitted, but everything can be forgiven by the grace of God. And that's the good news today and every day for every disciple, is to know that we are forgiven. We're forgiven. But it's made clear in that gospel that that forgiveness we receive is inextricably linked to our forgiving others. We can't receive that great forgiveness from the King without being prepared to show forgiveness to those around us. And that's sometimes where it can be very difficult. But it's almost as though if we fail to forgive, we're blocking the forgiveness of God. St. Augustine once wrote about how he noticed when people were saying the Our Father that they sometimes missed out a part at the end. And you can probably guess what that part is. It's the bit where we say, "Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us." Again, our willingness to forgive is what opens the door to experiencing God's forgiveness. During the week on Thursday, I did the funeral of a lovely Polish man called Jan. He was in his 90s. And I learned that as a small child living in eastern Poland, just as one side of Poland was being invaded by the Nazis, eastern Poland was being invaded by the Russians. And that's where his family lived. And in order to gain complete control of the country, the Russians exiled thousands of Polish men and women and children so that they could dominate that area. And so he and his family were taken to, of all places, Siberia. And there they lived for 2 years. He used to speak about making sure that when they got shoes, they got large shoes so they could wear lots of extra pairs of socks to protect them against the freezing cold. And also how they lived on the verge of starvation and experienced cruelty at the hands of their oppressors. But then after 2 years, they were allowed to leave and they set out on a march and they ended up somewhere near Iran. And then the tale got really interesting. There's a documentary about this where they were welcomed to India by a Maharaja. And this Maharaja Jam Sihab, his name was, made his land available to them, almost adopted them like his children. And they received the most incredible welcome as refugees. And any one of those thousands who lived there spoke so fondly of their years lived in India. It was a powerful experience for them. And so then eventually Jan came over to England and he was like a changed man because of that experience in India. He was able to leave behind him the bitterness and suffering of being in Siberia at the hands of his oppressors, to live a life filled with grace and happiness as a loving dad and grandparent. And it's like that experience of love and compassion, that grace of almost like forgiveness, healed and made whole those people who'd experienced pain and suffering. And that's the thing about forgiveness. Being a forgiving person is all wrapped up in that whole sense of being compassionate. It changes families and nations. But more than anything, it changes us. It makes us more positive, able to let go of anger or bitterness or a grudge or vengeance. And it all starts with God, like Jan experiencing grace and love in India. When we open our lives up to God and to Jesus, we experience the grace of his compassion. And when we share it with others, the true power and beauty and joy of that grace truly comes home.